Okay. So we're going to be wrapping up the Responsible AI track with one last panel session. So we've had really some great keynote speeches today talking about specific issues as well as thinking about some broader concepts around AI. So we're now going to actually bring a panel up that is going to talk about when is AI transparent enough? And so Mark in his opening keynote spoke about transparency and some of the accountability that Mozilla has brought to YouTube and some of their recommendation engines. And so we're going to dig deeper into that transparency conversation. So I'm going to invite up Billy Perego, who is a staff writer at Time, who is going to lead the panel discussion today. Hi, Billy. Yes, thank you, Billy. Thank you. Hey, Bianca.
Shall I? Okay.
Oh, of course, yes.
Hi, great to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, great to meet you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today's panel is called When is AI Transparent Enough? And I'm very lucky to be joined by an all-star panel. Dialing in from LA, we have Sophia Noble, who is a professor and also the co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. We have Blanca Escribano Cañas, who's a digital law partner at EY. We have Jeroen van der Hoven, who's professor of ethics and technology at Delft University, nearby. We also have Nanda Piersma, who's the scientific director of the Center of Expertise for Applied AI, which is also down the road in Amsterdam. And we have Leila Lee, who is from the responsible AI consultancy, COSA. And yeah, today we have a really wide-ranging discussion about the role of ethics and transparency in AI, how we can apply that in the daily work of everyone who's working in the very diverse fields of AI, but also what it really means and whether transparency is all that we need or whether we need to be thinking more deeply about these things. So I'd like to start off by asking each of my panelists, what does transparency mean to you? Leila, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I guess transparency, there are like two sides of it. Like one is to the builders of these technologies, like when is it transparent enough? And the second is that the end user who the technology is going to create an impact, when is it transparent enough for them? So I guess, yeah, that's the two sides that like when coming from like our work, this is how we are thinking about that.
Mm-hmm. And Jeroen?
I think we have to bear in mind that transparency is not something that we want per se, but it is something that is a servant to responsibility. We want things to be clear and to be transparent because we want people to be able to bear responsibility. So we have to look at a kind of a sectoral or context-specific, let's say, specification of transparent. What is transparent enough for one context may not be transparent enough for another context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Nanda, how about you?
Yeah, I was thinking about food. We need to be transparent about food. So we want to know what's in it and where does it come from. But we are not transparent of the effect of food on the people's life. So you get fat, you die from certain food. So the same holds for digital technology. So we want to know what's in it, how does it work, but we don't want to regulate, or we are not thinking about what the effect is. Or are we? Yes, we are always thinking on the effect of AI on people, but we don't have the tools to regulate it. Or we don't have the tools to think about what should we know about this, how can we control it yet. And I saw a lot of nice examples today. I'm really happy to be here, and this, I think, is the best track of the session here.
Glad to be here too. Blanca, how about you? I mean, what does transparency mean to you?
Well, you know, as a lawyer, well, in the other room, I heard that probably the sexiest profession is a data scientist. So I assume that the less sexy is, being a lawyer. And as a lawyer, well, I don't have opinions, so I will say what the law says. And in this respect, in Europe, we are about to have a new AI Act that will regulate horizontally, so for all sectors, artificial intelligence. And it has extraterritorial effects, so it will apply a lot as a standard. And there, it says that, there are two kind of concepts or definitions of transparency being, one of the core principles. One is related to interpretability, so how users can interpret the output generated by it. And the other side is information, so, physical persons being able to understand that they are interacting or communicating with an AI system. So, so two ideas, I think, is one of the core principles for AI to be ethical, and with those two meanings provided by the law.
Mm-hmm. Sophia, you've written a lot about the role of AI systems in our daily lives. I wonder what you think about transparency, and is it the be-all and end-all? If we're transparent, are we being responsible?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because there is a tremendous amount of focus on transparency as, kind of the ultimate solution here. But of course, there are many things in history and in the contemporary moment that are transparent, that are right here, available, evident, that we can see, that are harmful, that are dangerous, and we know all about them. So, of course, transparency is not going to be the full solution when it comes to technology and AI. I mean, I think that knowing about the harms that might come from a variety of systems is incredibly important. But being able to take action in relationship to the harms and stop the harms, and indeed find remedy to the harms, is probably a more appropriate and holistic way that we should be looking at the problems. And of course, I come at this in the United States as a Black American and African American woman. I will tell you that we see all kinds of tragedies and harms. Our communities experience centuries and millennia of harm, and it's extremely transparent. We know at a very detailed level how these types of systems work, and that doesn't have anything to do with whether they're legal or whether they're viable or culturally acceptable. So I think if we're going to talk about transparency, we're going to have a much wider frame than just, do we know everything we need to know about it?
I'm reminded of the terms of service that you're asked to sign when you sign up for pretty much anything online, but whether it's an iPhone or a Facebook account, it's transparent because the whole thing is there in front of you, but it's 400 pages long, and to read it would take 12 working days. So I'd like to open it up to the panel as to talk about how do we go beyond transparency? What do we need to interpret transparency to mean? How do we enact that in our lives? But what else do we need to do if we're talking about building AI systems that aren't harmful?
I think, from the previous sessions, people were talking about, how we're going from that awareness into principles and then into actions. I think we're still at the very nascent stage where a lot of the technology being created, people don't actually know what's being done to them. And if you're collecting the data from people and then, using these data to train models, and the models are taking actions, and there's results and the impact of those actions, do people actually know? And then that's probably the first step into creating this awareness and the transparencies. Then there are going to be regulations in place that will help, kind of reinforce or limit the impact of the technologies, and then we can go from there. But I think we're still at the very beginning stage where a lot of people just don't know what's being done to them. well, like, or they know, like, you know, Sophia is saying, like, we know very well, but what are we doing about that? So that's the next step, right?
Yeah, so in general, I would say that what is required is that we're able to go from principles to practice, and that we need to help ourselves to a methodology or kind of a transparent framework that will allow us to move from high-level principles to requirements and specifications, so, and can demonstrably show that all the values that we are so talk so much about, that we actually can convert them into requirements and then demonstrably show that they have been successfully implemented. Now that is the kind of thing that we saw, for example, in the privacy domain, where you say privacy enhancing technologies is what we need, and then you have to show that actually it's happening, it's successfully implemented, and you can work your way from a very high level abstract value of privacy to data protection, data minimization, coarse graining your data, etc., to all kinds of techniques. And you can go back to justify what you have done in the product or in the service. So that is what we need, not only for transparency and accountability and responsibility, but also for sustainability, for privacy, for autonomy of the user, all of these things that we are so big about, and justifiably so, that we can demonstrate, and we are trained as engineers and as AI specialists to do this, not once in a year or every 10 years, every day. You know, so we have to be able to integrate our ethics into our design practices.
Blanca, I wonder if, sorry, there's a kind of infancy right now to the legal framework that AI is landing into. I mean, in the EU, it's working on the AI Act. The Biden administration recently laid out its kind of Bill of Rights for AI. I wonder if you could kind of bring us all up to speed on where the regulatory side of things is and whether it goes far enough.
Well, as I anticipated in my introduction before, transparency is so important that now, you know, there is a new directive that will be enforced in Europe, developing the rules for liability. So, you know, when something goes wrong and there is a harm, and transparency has, you know, a central role, because it will be a presumption of fault, you know, in the AI provider, unless, you know, it's transparent enough. So, you know, it's a presumption of fault or liability unless you were transparent. That's really important, because if you build your system by design, as someone said, in a transparent way, and you document and you are ready to show how it works, you will be in a much better position if there are claims and someone is pointing at you as a liable or you know. So that's the, you know, the importance of transparency in the legal system, at least in Europe.
I mean, I don't know about you guys. I was watching, I think it was the first talk on the main stage this morning, or maybe it was the second, about this question of consciousness. Can these systems ever be conscious? And, you know, the majority of the AI research world figures no. They're not, definitely not right now, and they may not ever be able to be. But I do wonder whether this debate about consciousness and, you know, AI, you know, super intelligence really obscures something else about these systems. Sophia, you've done a lot of work into this. I wonder if you could share your thoughts on the kind of the role that hype is playing in the way that we consider what we consider AI systems to be, and what blind spots it might actually create for you know, regulating them and enacting them responsibly.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way in which, and of course, as I come to you from Los Angeles and, you know, a place like Hollywood, that's really been so profoundly responsible in many ways for the kind of cultural fantasy narrative of AI, AI and technology as kind of being anthropomorphic or like humans or better than humans. I mean, a lot of that narrative and that mythology is in the culture, and it is part of the tension, I think. And, unfortunately, some data scientists and computer scientists, believe that a very small handful that technologies like this will have consciousness, but we know that is absolutely impossible. I mean, there's just that, let's put that to rest, that AI will not be sentient. So we need to, I think, grapple with some of those things in the culture. But of course, in many ways, that cultural mythology is the snake oil that is sold to so many different kinds of institutions, companies, systems that are part of our lives. And so you see some of this, for example, one of the most horrific examples was in Pasco County in Florida, where you may recall a couple of years ago hearing the story of the sheriff's department being sold an AI system that would allegedly predict who in the county would most likely become a criminal. And what they did is they took all of the school records from young people in the county and they fed it into this snake oil system. And the sheriff's department and the police, law enforcement went about harassing young people on the streets constantly because they had decided that the AI had better sense making, better, let's say, consciousness than people. And unfortunately, that resulted in a young man committing suicide after having been stopped more than 17 times in a very short period of time, constantly under the watchful eye of law enforcement and the duress. And so we see this over and over and over, so many stories like this. During the Trump administration, the White House was talking about purchasing software that would predict who the next mass shooter would be, for example. So these ideas that somehow AI has a type of consciousness that is superior to human beings, rather than looking at other very clear reasons why people become mass shooters, living in a culture of gun violence, for example, lack of total lack of accountability around the cultures that produce mass murders and violence writ large. Again, going back to Hollywood. So I think these kinds of things are really important for us to be talking about because the pretext that is created by which companies then think that different types of AI are somehow better solutions for them when they are also completely unaware of and or not accountable and responsible for the outcomes of what happens when they engage in these kinds of fantasies, I think is so, so dangerous. And, of course, to me, this means we have to have a reckoning with the truth that so many of these systems are created just to increase profit share, right? To find new markets, whether it's schools, universities, governments, businesses. Most of these products are really about, making money and convincing people that they aren't making enough without them. And I think that's a very different kind of idea than, and truth-telling, quite frankly, than the idea that somehow AI has consciousness that's better than our own human consciousness.
If I can, yeah.
Sure.
I think your question is very pertinent, and I agree with the previous speaker that responsibility is a human thing. There was a beautiful article in The Guardian a couple of years ago that says this is about This is about Dr. Frankenstein, not about the monster, right? So responsibility is a human thing, and having these debates, let's say the more philosophical debates or geared towards the technique about consciousness or robot rights, people talk about robot as teammates, right, or cobots, or sharing a task with an artifact. That is, and the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre has pointed it out very clearly, we're always tempted to offload responsibility to things in our environment. Computer says no, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to be very careful. They're only human beings, whether they work in teams or as individuals or in institutions, are responsible. We cannot offload that responsibility. And therefore, we have to think hard about how we harness the power of that technology while hanging on to responsibility as an ideal. Mm.
Yeah, just I guess just to add on to that, just coming back to the topic of transparency, that when people think of AI, maybe they're thinking, oh yeah, well, it's sentient, or maybe it's very objective, but it's not more objective than the data that we feed them, than the people that's building this technology. Like say, there was a healthcare algorithm that was kind of deciding, okay, in a pool of patients, like when we have limited healthcare resources, who do we prioritize? And it was later discovered it was really denying care to qualifying Black patients, because the assumption in building this algorithm is that the urgency for care equates to how much money they actually spend on their care in the past. So that's the assumption that went into building this algorithm. And I think we need the transparency to tell people, hey, this is the assumption that went into building it, that most people understand. Well, that shouldn't be the case. Like, more money you spend on your healthcare doesn't mean you need it more, just means you have more money, right? Then that's like later down the line where we see a lot of negative impacts because of these assumptions were not transparent from the beginning. They weren't questioned. Yeah.
It's kind of ironic that often the things that are most necessary to be disclosed through transparency are the very things that the company tries to hide while it's releasing its page-long transparency obligations. In a totally unrelated point, it's interesting to see companies like OpenAI releasing their generative image tools to the public, all the while saying that the data sets that they've trained them on contain racial biases, potential for violent imagery and sexist imagery, and then saying, oh, but we need to release them into the world to stress test them against the public and to anticipate how they're going to be used. It strikes me that we're where social media was about 10, 15 years ago, where you're kind of releasing this untested technology into the world and then seeing it have an effect before regulations can really form. Sophia, I know you've spoken about this in the past. Do you have any thoughts on that parallel?
Yeah, I think you really put it so well. I mean, it's true that many of these projects are beta tested on the most vulnerable people in the world, or the people who have the least resources to fight back, or for whom the legal regimes and other types of systems of redress or recourse are not available, because we either don't have the case law on the books, or we don't have the statutes and laws passed in our countries, in our cities. And so I think this is one of the most dangerous dimensions of the unleashing, if you will, of these technologies. And of course, we can think of other industries, and I go back to like the cultural mystique around AI that really the tech industry has created to protect itself and insulate itself from responsibility. Because if we were to take the same logics and deploy them, let's say, to the pharmaceutical industry, we certainly would never let a couple of guys dream up, mix up some compounds, package them up, and roll them out in every drugstore in America or in the world. And when people die or are devastatingly harmed from that drug that's just been released into the wild, we would never come back and say, well, it's just chemistry. And it's just really a matter of the kinds of compounds that human beings put back together. And, they had a choice because we put a label on the package. I mean, we just would never use these kinds of logics. We would have an understanding of what's happening. But in fact, what we have all over the world are people making software and different kinds of projects and releasing them on the public. And after we see who's been harmed, whose lives have been devastated, who's been damaged, who's been ethnically cleansed, I mean, we could really get quite serious here. We're not just talking about automation in a manufacturing site. If we get very serious about it, then we would say we would absolutely never allow that to happen. And in fact, we would apply the same kind of criminal logics and responsibility to those bad actors. And I think, this is the place that we should be very honest in our conversations about remedies and recourses.
So we don't have long left. Nanda, I want to go to you. You work on the more applied side of AI. Do you have any thoughts about what Sophia says, and how do you hope that people who work in the more applied side of AI will take these thoughts into consideration?
I think most of the people here are actually building these systems. So are we the bad guys and the bad girls? We try to do the right thing. And we're not intentionally building AI that is going to be harmful. But still, it's going to be like that. And I think that one of the things that we can do as the people who are building this system is think about our criteria. What are we striving for? We are striving for the best accuracy. We are striving for the fastest algorithm. Why can't we strive for the fairest algorithm and put it into the model? And that's what we are doing at the University of Applied Sciences. We are experimenting with algorithms that fairness beats accuracy. But how much are we beating it? Is it 0.0003 point less accurate? And are we happy with that? Well, she's still going to be discriminated, I know. But we will have other measurements that we are going to use, other criteria, and try to build systems that might steer towards perhaps digital integrity. I would like to name it. So why poke into someone's personal data where you don't need to, where you have an alternative? And that's the technical part that we need to explore as system developers. And all these ethical frameworks that we are being bombarded with, it's just a lot of extra work. But if we build it into our quality assessment of our systems, then it becomes fun, because then we have the best quality product, which is the most ethical product, and then it's something that we can manage because it's in our model. So I would call upon everyone to put it in your model and put it in your goals.
Retrofitting it is much, much, much harder.
As you said, you don't.
Right, that's all we have time for. Thanks to all of my panelists for joining me, and thanks to the audience.
So this ends our Responsible AI Getting It Right talk track. So if you want to make your way back to the main hall, at 4:40, the afternoon plenary sessions will start. And thank you again for all of your attention this afternoon.